Today's episode is brought to you by NAIM Audio, the iconic British HiFi brand. NAIM recently launched the Unity Atom Headphone Edition, a headphone-optimized version of its multiple award-winning Unity Atom music streaming system, designed to be the ultimate solo listening source. Unlike traditional headphone amplifiers and DACs, which require a separate computer or streaming device, Unity Atom Headphone Edition is a fully formed music streaming system. Just add headphones. Discover the NAIM difference at NAIMAUDIO.com. That's NAIMAUDIO.com. Today's episode is also sponsored by SCHIITdotCOM. SCHIITdotCOM designs and builds audio components in California. Based in Valencia, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit SCHIIT.com or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's www.SCHIIT.com. This episode is also brought to you by Bryston. Bryston amplifiers have an equally exceptional reputation in the recording studio and the audiophile home because their sound is clear and true. Bryston amplifiers are also backed by the industry's best warranty, 20 years. Upgrade your amp to a Bryston today. Visit www.BRYSTON.com. That's BRYSTON.com.
What is British HiFi? My opinion about British HiFi is, by and large, they're more intimate speakers. They're a large step towards, and British systems are a large step towards headphones. They're more intimate. They're very good. They're extremely detailed, lush, and so on and so forth, and they're seductive. But what they're not, never will be, is big. And that means as if you...
physically big.
Physically big. You can stack them up, try to make them bigger, but they're still not going to be what a big giant studio monitor JBL is. It's never going to do that. So I think it's a smaller, better, solid, more faithful sound. And if you want something to, if you want to have a guy or a gal playing a guitar and singing, Joni Mitchell's right there in the corner singing at us, I think that would be much more well-served on a good British system than many American systems, because they're all small. There are small American systems too. But the Brits kind of own it. They did it. So that's just my opinion. But if you want to an 1812 overture, the British have smaller living rooms, I think, too, just because of constraints. That's pretty much it. It's a smaller sound of higher fidelity. God help me. Lightning bolts are going to come in. Nobody will speak to me at Rocky Mountain anymore. It's from this country, but you know what? If they're going to be that way, screw them.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. This is episode 9, season 5. And what you just heard was our intro comment to What is British HiFi? That's the title of this show. And that was Mike Moffat of SCHIIT and Theta Digital fame. And his kind of 2 cents. He's an American, obviously. That is kind of his perspective, and we're going to have a lot more perspectives to share with you from some more British influences, some people who have lived there and are part of the scene from there. But first, I just wanted to share with you that I do have a bit of a fascination with the British myself. I had some time that I spent there a couple of months after I graduated, as people from the Midwest do, traveled through with a backpack to England, the UK, and I was absolutely fascinated with the culture there, the way that the language is just slightly different than American vernacular. And I think that's kind of symbolic of how audio has also shaped around that. There are some similarities, but we're going to explore kind of what the differences are and this idea of what exactly is British HiFi. And by that I mean, is it a brand? Is it a sound? Is it a particular frequency response? Is it a unique market? Does it have anything to do with near-field listening or a particular type of room? We'll explore all this stuff in the podcast. And I just want to kick it off by also introducing and welcoming to the show Marc Phillips of the PartTimeAudiphile network. How are you doing today, my fine friend?
Hey, Brian. How's it going? I'm eager to talk about this because this is everything to me. This is my whole reason for being into high-end audio in the first place. So I'm looking forward to the show.
Yeah, and I'm very happy for you to be here because we recently did an episode about two-ways and integrateds that I thought was absolutely fantastic. And it kind of was like the tip of the iceberg on this. It actually kind of opened the door to this idea of, what is British Hi-Fi and how do you get excited about it and like really what's going on here.
Okay, so Mike Moffat kind of hit on why I got into Brit Hi-Fi in the first place, and I really think a lot of it was by accident, where all through my teenage years I was kind of into Japanese mass market mid-fi, Sansui and all the regular brands, AR and Dual and everything else. And so when I left home, went to college and then I became a young single guy out living in the San Fernando Valley, I noticed that I was having a problem enjoying my hobby because I was pissing off all of my neighbors and everything. So what I had to do was figure out a way to listen to a system that was musically rewarding for me without, upsetting everybody. Because for me, there's nothing worse than getting that, that knock on the door saying, "Hey, buddy, can you turn that off?" And I was a kid with an older brother, and so my story is always, my dad coming in the door saying, "Turn that stuff down." So, and I hate that because, and I still think about it sometimes if I'm really, jamming out. But so what it was is
do you feel like your dad might charge in at any time when the stereo's loud and yell at you? You're traumatized.
Well, for years I did, but that kind of went away in the last few years because my dad was over, especially when I lived in Colorado a few years ago, that my dad would come over and he would listen to his favorites. And, and it was a funny thing. By that time we were listening to the same stuff. And I found out what a huge Harry Belafonte fan he is. So I would play all that stuff. So he never complained after that. So
nice.
But my older brother was listening to Black Sabbath and Steppenwolf and everything else. And so it was brutal. So here I am. I'm a single guy living in a 1-bedroom apartment in San Fernando Valley. This is the beginning of the 90s. I happened upon a dealer, and his name is Gene Rubin. I've talked about him many times before. He was my dealer for so many years, and he specialized in BritFi. And I remember going to my very first hi-fi show, which was a stereophile show in LA, which was 1992, I believe. And he had a room there, and I went and I sat and I listened to a system that was BritFi, and it was it was Name, and it was Spendor, and it was Riga, and a few other things. And I really said, wow, this sounds really great. Look at those speakers. They're little teeny speakers, but they sound so good, and they sound so real. And so slowly I started buying things one at a time, and had some Name amplifiers and some Riga turntables. And over the years, I was able to listen to a really great sounding system in my little 1-bedroom apartment without pissing anybody off. And it was really the birth of my love for high-end audio was BritFi. And so Mike Moffat talks about, this was great, his comment about the headphones, that it was approaching headphone sound and listening to Brit Hi-Fi. So, we're talking about near-field monitors and everything else going on there. And the small rooms, sounding good in a small room, which is basically the thing about British Hi-Fi, is that people had small homes and they didn't have dedicated listening rooms, and that their stereo, their hi-fi, had to integrate into their small house and their small living room and wherever else they had it. So it had to sound good without creating this gigantic, perfectly tuned, acoustically inert listening room. It had to sound really good in people's homes. And for me, that was a great way to start out because of that, I was able to create a good sound in a small space. And back then, for not a lot of money, a lot of the BritFi wasn't expensive stuff necessarily. It was cheap, especially in Britain.
I also want to ask you, Mark, there are a lot of things about audio that are either intentionally vague or vague just because of the very nature of them. Like the sonics, we have to use other senses to describe what we hear just because it's hard to tangibly kind of put these things together to explain them. Do you think there's any element of that with the British Hi-Fi idea? Is it vague and non-specific unintentionally or intentionally for any reason? Or is it always something that people have gone, no, this is Brit Hi-Fi? It just kind of flies under the radar a little bit more because it's a subset of a subset of a subset of things to do.
So when I started getting into British Hi-Fi, I did think that there was a distinct sound, but as we were getting ready to talk about this, I realized that there is more to it. It is kind of vague because you can talk about what the British Hi-Fi sound is, and one of the things we hadn't discussed was the idea of Pratt, which is P-R-A-T, and that was pretty much when you talked about Brit-Fi. Eventually, the subject of Pratt would come up, and that was something that they used to define that sound for what it was. And I always thought the British Hi-Fi sounded polite and refined, which was fine by me because I tried to be a polite and refined person, in my life, I guess, and so it reflected, what I wanted to be. So I wasn't into like jamming it loud and I had to get 20 hertz in there, and no, I didn't need any of that. I'd already learned to listen around, that kind of thing. So for me, the British Hi-Fi is also the history and where we are today because of British Hi-Fi and all of the technological advancements that they did in England. I didn't even know this till recently, but Cambridge Audio actually was the first to use a toroidal transformer in any of their amplification. I didn't know that. I didn't know, Cambridge was such a innovative force, but there's the quad ESL, so that was our first electrostatic speaker, and people are still listening to. They're so good that people are still listening to ESL 57s today. And the first one was made back in 1956, and it's still completely satisfying.
Okay, so next up, we have the answer to the question from Johan Coorg of JC Sound Business. And I first met this individual who I would consider very British in a very complimentary way when he was working for KEF. And so he kind of gave us his answer to this question, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So check this out.
The idea of British Hi-Fi is tossed around a lot. What exactly is this? Well, it's become increasingly harder to define, but I think it's reputationally British Hi-Fi because of the manufacturers and because of, for want of a better word, the seriousness of the BBC. This was a phenomenon which endured for a long time, and not least because of the many famous old names which cropped up during the 50s and 60s. KEF, which was 1961, and countless more amplifier manufacturers. But it's more than that. You ask, is it a brand? Is it a sound? Well, all over the world, people talk about, still to this day, which I think has become a little bit inappropriate, the British Hi-Fi sound. Is it a sound? Is it a particular frequency response? Well, kind of, I suppose. I think the BBC, certainly in its approach, in its recording methods, was known for making flat recordings. No part of the frequency spectrum was accentuated. If we are to look at this the other way around, I think probably reputationally American sound, American recordings was, shall we say, mid-bass heavy around 80 hertz. The French sound was over-accentuation of mid-range, wah, wah, wah. The German manufacturers, certainly in the early days, the speakers tended to be balanced, for example, dare I say it, boom tiz. So perhaps the British sound was, I don't know, reflective of the reputational British character of understated and not exaggerated, which has come to mean something. You asked about the LS35A. It's just like a legendary moniker. People often associate LS35A with a particular speaker, but it was in fact code. It was a code for a project by the BBC to create near-field monitors for to effectively reproduce speech, mainly newsreaders for outside broadcast vans, to be as accurate as possible, and was trying to create specification for small monitor to create, particularly, of course, because in those days it was to reproduce male voice, but the LS35A products which came out of it, they all had KEF drive units and crossovers, and I'm sure people know about this, but were manufactured. The LS35A were put together by a lot of manufacturers. It was never intended to be a full frequency hi-fi speaker, if you like, but its properties were much loved by audiophiles. The whole project and the products gained legendary status.
So, Mark, at the end of his clip, he kind of talks about a little bit of the history in the products. Are there any representation of British HiFi in people's minds, and kind of how do we look at what the BBC did and the LS35A and how that kind of works into the rest of the products that we see?
Well, that's kind of a big thing. So for me, British HiFi revolves around first the quad ESLs, and then by 72 we had the Lin turntable, which really kind of revolutionized our ideas on what a turntable itself contributed to the overall sound. And there was that, and people will argue about other turntables that were there before, Thorns, but we're not going to get into that. But the BBC, the whole BBC thing is really important because the BBC monitors were unusual. And you told me you were, I remember being really confused by the fact that I would look at something like the LS35A and different companies would be making it. So which one's the best, whatever. And I never understood why that happened until I realized that the BBC made these speakers and they designed them and they built a few pairs. So like on the LS35A, there are actually something like 20 pairs out there that were built by the BBC. And I'm sure they're probably worth a lot of money. I've never seen one. I don't know what I'd be looking for, but there are BBC made ones, but they're a communications company. They didn't want to build loudspeakers, so they sold the licenses of the design to various speaker manufacturers. So the first one was like Rogers. Rogers started doing it. This is back in 75. So Rogers did it, and then KEF did it. And KEF is the one, if you really want to know what KEF contributed to speaker design, the biggest thing is that their parts made the LS35A. So they supplied the parts. And a lot of the production run on these speakers had to do with KEF supplying the parts, eventually running out of the parts, people having to either find replacements, making it no longer an LS35A, or they had to re-engineer them, which is something that Falcon Acoustics, who is the only licensee making the LS35A today, they re-engineered the parts from, so they just went back and just rebuilt everything. So there's all that, but the simple fact is that we had Rogers and KEF and Goodman's, Harbeth and Spendor, Chartwell, Sterling Broadcast, RAM, a few other ones, all making them, and the rule was that only 3 companies would have access to the license at the same time. And and so that's really a weird story to tell in the context of high-end audio, that there was the BBC. It was like saying for us, like, oh, do you like those ABC or CBS speakers? And that's the difference. But it was very important because these designs were very technical. They were used in the field. The LS35A started off being a near-field monitor on location so they could ensure that the sound quality of the broadcast would be excellent. And it turned out to be just this really, really amazing little speaker that did a lot of things that we hadn't heard until then. And so, I mean, that's the big thing. So that's where BBC comes in. So a lot of people, when they talk about BritFi, first thing in their mind is the BBC speakers. The LS35As and the LS58s and the 5.8s and the 5.9s and the 6s and the BC1s and all those during the year. And they really formed what we think of as British HiFi sound, which is not huge. I mean, even the big ones like the Spender SP100 and the Harbeth 40, they only went down to like 40 hertz. So they, nobody in England was really getting those 20 hertz speakers, at least until B&W came along.
Now, Mark, what about the quad ESL? You mentioned Lin, you mentioned the name, we talked about the LS35A. How does the quad ESL fit into this picture, and when did it come along?
Okay, so the first quad ESL 57 was in 56. I always thought it was 57, but it came out in 56. It was the first electrostatic speaker. One of the things about it was that it was in the near field. was just so realistic, far more realistic than anybody had heard up to that point. They didn't know, and it was really funny because back in the day, they used to sell them in a single speaker. So you had a mono setup. So there were these setups where they'd have an old amplifier and hooked up to it, and they had one single ESL that they would sit directly in front of and get this amazing sound. And then stereo, in the late 50s, stereo became big, and then everybody was listening to two quad ESL 57s. But to this day, I mean, if you sit in a near field of a pair of mint ESL 57s, they don't have real highs and lows. It's mostly in the mid-range, but you will never hear just a more transparent, beautiful sound from a speaker, especially of that vintage. The Brits couldn't even improve upon that sound for something like 28 years. They made that in production, and then they just made another one that was, a little more easy to use. But the ESL for me, is where BritFi starts. That's when people start going, oh, I mean, and even you go a little bit before that, because Quad also made amplifiers back then, 10, 15 years before that, and they were actually becoming really popular too. And it's because they're good sounding. They invented current dumping, which kind of gives you a sound quality that's between Class A and Class AB. And a lot of people still like that sound. So that's where it started, is with Quad. And then, so you're talking about the 50s and what they were doing in the 50s. And they had like Leek and Radford amplifiers back there and Quad amplifiers. People in Britain, there was a lot of audiophiles, a lot of people who were really into this in the 50s and the 60s. And then by the 70s, of course, is when you kind of saw a second wave with the Linz and the Riga, just all the other brands came along, Mission and Arcam and ATC. That's kind of the beginning of it too. But to this day, I still would love to have a pair of mint ESL 57s just to play with, just to listen to them, because they're really amazing. And if you're careful, you can get good sound. You don't have to be in the near field. But again, that's the idea of sitting up close to a speaker and letting it kind of surround you. And to this day, I mean, the LS35As are magical in that way too.
All right, so up next we have Andrew Jones of ELAC. That's where he's currently doing work, but he has a lot of success with Pioneer. He's also worked at KEF and TAD. So he has a very rich, long history with hi-fi, creating speakers. But he also, he's from England, and he has a history in British hi-fi, I think, as well. He's brought up in that. So here's his comments on the same idea.
British hi-fi is interesting because there's almost two types of British hi-fi. If we look back through the history of British hi-fi, there's the one epitomised by the BBC, because a lot of the speakers that came out, BBC used manufacturers to supply them with product like the LS35A, but they'd done the design work and it was for their purposes. And so you get Rogers and KEF were involved, and Spendor, all adherents to that kind of sound. And it was always a fulsome, mellow sound, I think. But then there was another tradition came in, spearheaded by Lynn and Naim, where it was not the traditional British hi-fi, but became maybe a new British hi-fi, and joined by companies like Mission, and the sound was more concentrating on the dynamics and the rhythm and flow of the music, and it wasn't always as easy to listen to in one sense. That rich, warm, comforting sound is a very attractive one to relax in and listen to, whereas the one epitomised by Lynn and Naim and those followers was almost more about the danceability of the sound that you're hearing. And I think those two factions still exist. And here in America, my best guess is that when people talk about British sound, they're meaning that old, mellow sound. That was more like the East Coast sound here in the States, as opposed to the West Coast JBL-led studio sound. That was similar kind of split in the direction of the sound character that people were looking for. Obviously, LS35A is more of a near-field listening speaker because that's what it was developed for. in studios. It developed for the mobile recording studio, so they had a good quality monitor. And yes, they were listening close. And because it's a very small speaker with limited bass dynamics, if you listen too far away, you're going to be restricted in volume level. I think it's more just that tonality. And it's not even necessarily about how low it goes. It's just that touch of richness in the mid-bass region that does it. And of course, the LC35A does not go loud. It is deliberately bumped up in that mid-bass region to give you the feeling that you got bass without having to try and reproduce from a 5-inch driver real bass. And because in the old days we also had Japanese sound for speakers, which went even further in that dynamic direction and was not liked in the US or the UK that much. So Japanese design speakers, although technically very good, they failed for our markets in the tonality that they were introducing into the speakers. We've still got some hangovers of the British sound, but on the whole, it's less influenced by country these days because it's a world market where good quality speakers are manufactured everywhere. And I think these days, primarily, it's driven by whoever's designing the product. But that can even, and I don't mean company-wise, I mean the engineers involved in that process. You do have some companies that seem to keep a sound over years and years and years. Let's say Klipsch, for example, for over here, that they define who they are. And even in their bookshelf speakers, there's a semblance of the sound that they get in the classic series, that originated way back to the 40s and 50s. So it's always fascinated me how, if different people are designing those speakers, how do you transfer the knowledge of what that character is that's wanted? It's like any company that has designers, the fashion industry. Clearly, in some of these big companies now, it's not even the original designer who founded the company that is doing the design work, but it's instantly recognizable. Oh, that came from that design group. And to an extent, it works with hi-fi as well. But I feel in all the companies I've been to, I've been lucky to be in a position where most times what I choose to do isn't questioned and said, no, change it to this instead. So as I moved from Kef to Infinity to Pioneer and TAD and now ELAC, I've taken that essence with me. And I don't know, you could instantly just listen to a speaker and go, that's an Andrew one.
All right. What do you think, Mark?
Well, first of all, I love what Andrew Jones said, because first of all, if you're talking about hi-fi sound, BritFi or whatever you want to call it, he is kind of the personification of it today in this age because of all the great speakers.
Great point, yeah.
But my favorite thing about what he just said was the whole thing about bringing up the East Coast, West Coast sound that we had in the United States, because it's part of a spectrum that includes the BritFi. Mike Moffat say that listening to a British hi-fi was a lot like listening to a headphone system with that intimacy. You go back into the 70s in American speaker design, and you had the West Coast sound, which was JBL, and it was big and it was powerful, deep bass, and they were really pushing the envelope, and then it was all about frequency response and dynamics. And then you had the guys on the East Coast, like Bozak and Boston. Boston Acoustics was a good example of that. And so they were closer to what the BritFi sound was, smaller speakers, more polite sound, more forgiving of the room. So, and I love that he brings that up. That's the same thing in British hi-fi. We were talking about the BBC and that classic sound, and even Lynn and the Quad and what that was about. But there definitely was another wave of manufacturers in Britain that were offering an alternative to that was almost all the way back to that West Coast sound with us. And we're talking about the Mission, and ATC has always been an interesting one for me because ATC is so much a British monitor. It's used in pro audio and everything, but it sounds completely different than from the BBC designs. So they're very, very powerful. They're inefficient. They need a lot of power. They're time aligned. So they're a different way to go. So the English world of hi-fi split, just like the American one did in the 70s. I loved how he brought that up because we don't think about it in those terms a lot.
Is there even a difference with a British hi-fi magazine than some of the press? Because we're involved here heavily in the U.S. on the Part-Time Audiophile Network. We go to the shows, we talk to the people. Okay, so there's at least one hi-fi show in Heathrow that goes on every year, but we don't really cross over as much as we do, like, let's say, with Munich. The Germany show is like the international show for us. But even with that kind of overlap, do you think that there is a difference between like a British hi-fi mag and a U.S. publication? Because there are several websites and magazines that are very British hi-fi in nature.
Yes, because I started off back in I was a teenager really, and I was reading American magazines like High Fidelity and Audio and Stereo Review. And it wasn't until I got to college pretty much that I discovered the stereophile and absolute sound and what high-end audio really was. Well, I took a third step into, and I'm not sure how I did this other than I think the local bookstore always had British audio magazines like Hi-Fi News and Record Review and What Hi-Fi. I used to read those, and it was like entering another world that I'd never heard of, where there were all these brands that were, and the simple thing was they just didn't get distributed and imported to the United States. The bigger ones, the brands we've already talked about, like Quad and Lin and Harbeth and Spender and all those, they got to the United States and people knew about them. When you start going in and you start looking at all the speakers that you've never heard of before, and then people talk in England talking about, oh my God, those are the best speakers in the world, and you're like, oh, I'd really like to hear that, And so that really opened up my mind to the fact that we didn't have a list of hi-fi brands and components that were available everywhere in the world that was very specialized. And you go to Britain and you see a lot of things. You see a lot of things that you've never seen before. You see turntables you've never heard of before. It's a whole world, and it's very interesting because everything I loved about BritFi, there was more of it. I just had to, find a way to do it. And that brings me really quickly to a story that I had a few years ago, is that there was an integrated from Pioneer, but it was Pioneer UK, which was very different from the other divisions because they had Pioneer UK made things for British audience. They made BritFi in the huge giant conglomeration in Japan, but they focused on this and they came out with a integrated amplifier called the A400. I heard so many great things about it. Like every audiophile in England has one of these because it's 63 watts per channel, which was, nice and for that time. And it came in at 240 pounds when it was introduced in 1990. And so I had heard so many good things about it that I tried to see if I could get one of these into the United States. Big problem was the power conversion going from 220 to 110. And where there are solutions to that, the power supply, but people warned me, they said, yeah, but if you convert it to 110, it takes away the magic of the sound. And so I never got a chance to hear one until a few years ago when I went to Australia, and my friend Brad Serhan, who's a loudspeaker designer, had one in his living room. And I go, dude, that's an A400. And he's like, yeah, so? And I go, I've never heard one before. He goes, you want to listen to it? And we listened to it. And it was just like, he was surprised that I had never heard an A400. I think I might have written an angry letter to Pioneer once saying, why don't you bring this into the States? It's, what's it going to be, $400 or $500 for a 63 watt per channel amplifier that sounds fantastic? I'm in. I'll buy two and give one to a friend. But it didn't happen. And I haven't been to England either. And I'm English, I'm British, but I've never been there. And I would really love to go there and just hit all the shops and just see what they've got and listen to all the stuff because it sounds great.
So the last question I kind of have for you, Mark, is we've talked about all the different aspects to Brit Hi-Fi and where it's from and what it is. Now, how about this? Is it still a thing or was it a thing? Did it have a peak or is it still relevant today?
Yeah, that's a good question because, like I said, it came in waves. The Quad was wave 1, and the in the 70s were wave 2, and the fact that there's companies like Harbeth And I'm not sure what they're like today after COVID, but forever it was a 6-month wait on a Harbest speaker, which is a good place to be. So Harbest are selling, and they're selling in the United States. And I always thought that was amazing that they were a success because they're small. They're small boxes. They don't look like, anything fancy. They're just small. They're usually beautiful cabinets, but they're small 2-ways and 3-ways, and the prices are not exactly cheap. So we're talking about small 2-way speakers that are magically getting up to $10,000. And I always thought it was a tough sell. And I've run into people who are like, no, it's not enough speaker to me. And it's like, well, it is, but you don't, realize it. Today, I think it's still out there, but I think it has evolved. I think you have something like B&W, and B&W came along, and B&W is undoubtedly one of the biggest and most popular speaker manufacturers in the world right now. And they're not making British HiFi. They're, even though they're British, they're making something that's big and sounds big, famous for going deep down in the bass. And they're really popular. And I think maybe they changed a lot of it. Whereas it's like, this is British, but it doesn't sound British. But for me, it's like, I'll never get over listening to something Brit HiFi. And I'll give you a perfect example is the LFD NCSE Mark III integrated amplifier that I just reviewed. LFD is a very small amplifier company. They basically designed one great sounding amplifier circuit, and over the years they've just refined it to where I bought one in the late 90s for $11.95. The NCSE, which is basically the same amp, better parts, more quiet. They've but it's still the same basic design, is $73.95, and it doesn't even have a remote control, which I keep bringing up because if it had a remote control, I would have bought it. But not that I care that much about remote controls, but that's the only thing keeping it from being the perfect amplifier for me. But listening to that amplifier, and I just reviewed it, just reminded me everything I loved about BritFi and how it's just so human and so warm and so emotional and at the same time it's reserved and polite and refined. It's classy stuff. And so I don't think it has the following it does, but the following's still there and I still follow it. So earlier it was mentioned that Japanese hi-fi, and I mean we can really get into this whole thing about different countries having different sound qualities, and at first you're like, it's kind of stereotyping, but no, it's the culture bringing in what's important and the kind of music they were brought up on. So I always think French hi-fi sounds a certain way, British hi-fi sounds a certain way, and somebody brought up Japanese hi-fi, which is what I drifted from when I got out of Brit hi-fi. That's the only thing that convinced me to look elsewhere was Japanese hi-fi. So I think there's a crossover between the values there and the sonic priorities.
Yeah, I'm like fascinated by the regionalism of the market, really. It's not even about, I think it is partially about the culture, but it also is just about the market, like the demands of the market, what people are listening to, and how that, cyclical kind of demand, that someone listens to this, they want that same thing, and they like it, and then their neighbor wants to buy it, and all of a sudden a market takes on a life of its own that's separate from the global market, which might be going on at the time.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened with British Hi-Fi. It's all about who is buying it, who is listening to it, and making it for them.
We're just going to end with Rob Watts of Chord Electronics, a very smart man. He submitted a written statement that I'll read for you guys here right now. But he also is, I would consider to be very British. The company itself is hilariously so British, to me at least, that from a press perspective, they only submit their pricing in British pounds and never at the product launches till they say what the American dollar would be. It's very hardcore. I love that about them. So here we go. I'm not sure about the myth of British sound, but like all myths, there's a grain of sand of truth. I think perhaps there was a British sound with loudspeakers in the 70s, and no doubt the BBC had something to play in that for the requirements of neutrality. But as to whether this applies to electronics, I don't see that. But then I have a somewhat tunnel vision, seeing things through a prism of my own work. And with that, I am only concerned with making it as transparent as possible, transparent in the true meaning of the word. And so that means I'm not trying to create a sound at all. The other issue about this is, are there other sounds? American, British, Asian, or German? I generally think in terms of high-end sound. I don't hear this. When I actually travel to show and meet lots of audiophiles, I was struck by how consistent people's opinions were about what they wanted from sound quality. Indeed, looking at different manufacturers, there's no consistent geographic sound, at least not from the electronics or high-end headphones. But there is an exception to this rule. I spent some time at Tokyo dealers, and that experience was very strange. A bright sound lacking bass extension. And when working on a DSP project, I was looking at correcting transducer's frequency response, and mid-fi IEMs from Japan had a lot of severe bass problems, with a first order roll-off at 100 Hz. So perhaps there's a Japanese sound. This is not so noticeable at the high end though with both audiophiles or manufacturers. The Occasional Podcast is a production of the PartTimeAudiphile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiphile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and AudioHead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.